The purpose of our meeting today is to take a look at what we've been doing in our work group with regards to financing water projects. Also, we're going to have a presentation from the Water Infrastructure Finance Authority, commonly known as WIFA, with regards to planning for potential water supply or the Water Development Fund. And also, Carol Ward is going to give us a storage site subcommittee update. So we're going to turn the time over now to former ADWR Director Sandy Favorites for her work and a review of her work that we did in the finance work group. Sandy, I see you're on. Please go ahead and take it out.
All righty. Thanks, Wade. And I'm going to correct one thing you said. Not my work. I'm going to have Vinitha really get into the details of what was been done, but I just wanted to set up a little bit of information on why we sort of went back down this path. In past commissions, governors commissions, and such, we've looked at financing as an integral part of augmentation, but have never really gotten anywhere as far as major funding at the state level for projects. And recognizing this year some of the efforts of the speaker and Mrs. Griffin and others in getting water into major water project or major water funding into the budget, we still felt it was important to sort of give an overview of what's being done or what has been done in the past in Arizona, and then looking outside of Arizona at what other folks are doing in this arena for funding major water augmentation projects. So I'll join back after Vinitha's done with her presentation, and we'll talk a little bit more about where the subcommittee or the subcommittee has landed. But Vinitha, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Sandy. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. So
Yes,
good
we
morning,
can hear you,
Chairperson
Vinitha.
Noble. Thank you, Jenna. So good morning, Chairperson Noble, Representative Griffin, and respected members of the committee. My name is Vinitha Karta, Water Resources Manager for Freeport-McMoran. Sandy's my boss, of course. The Finance Subcommittee was tasked with identifying potential mechanism to finance the acquisition of water supplies and also infrastructure necessary to treat and deliver that water supply. So under Sandy's direction, my research towards assisting the subcommittee with this task involved primarily three things: previous actions taken by the state that Sandy already mentioned, identifying mechanisms and revenue sources utilized by other Southwestern states and also countries, and finally also looking at available federal funding. You could move to the next slide, please. Of course, we also looked at why this project was so important and what major roadblocks we face. First and foremost, our state is located in a watershed that has been a drought for more than 2 decades. So we are looking at a looming shortage of Colorado River supply starting next year, but we also have to continue to protect groundwater reserves and other in-state surface water supplies. And we have to do all of this while continuing to meet the growing demand for water supplies. This requires really innovative financing, vast, different type of funding mechanisms, and also consideration of new ways to expand those water supplies for us. Historically, however, state appropriated funding sources are very rarely or not available. And of course, that is beginning to change with the FY22 state budget. For smaller communities and rural communities, it has been very hard or impossible even to invest in infrastructure because they just don't have the tax base. Or in case of private utilities, they just don't have the rate base. For private utilities, the approval process to increase rates have been cumbersome. But if you look at the last bullet point on the right side, the Water Resources Development Commission back in 2012 in their report projected costs for water infrastructure ranging from $34 million to more than $1 billion. So if you move to slide 3, slide 4, next one. So this is really not a new subject because the WRDC has looked at it. They projected some astronomical costs, but while they did that, they also looked at, they also identified funding mechanisms and revenue sources to meet these demands. The WRDC recognized a water supply development revolving fund. This fund was established back in 2007 by the state legislature with the intent of providing low-cost loans to water providers for the acquisition of water supplies and development of water infrastructure. Same thing that we are doing now. The legislation that authorized the fund identified several revenue sources for the funds, including issuance of water supply development bonds, appropriations, federal monies, monies received from water providers in the form of loan payments, and interest, and so on. It has really taken almost 14 years for the Water Supply Development Revolving Fund to be funded. If this fund is to be a potential source for water infrastructure financing, one or more sources of dedicated funding will have to be established. Moreover, because such revolving funds take at least 8 to 10 years to be fully established, there will need to be a consistent and dedicated funding source in the beginning, like certain tax revenues or state appropriations, until this fund is well established. WRDC therefore proposed several revenue sources towards funding infrastructure needs, and that's what you're seeing at the bottom of the list here. If you move to the next slides, and the next one. So while those were proposals from WRDC, which identified a fund and revenue sources, there are currently existing sources of funding, and these are available from various federal agencies. What you have here is a list of the different agencies, the funding program that provides funds, certain match required, and eligible applicants. I wanted to put in more information, but it was taking up too much space. So the specialty about these funds was because there has been changes in the past decade in response to certain executive actions from the US President's office. A number of these federal agencies have expanded their programs to fund infrastructure that is resilient to climate change and also to drought. FEMA's hazard mitigation grant, for example, has expanded to include aquifer storage and recovery and aquifer recharge and recovery, and projects that best address weather extremes receive additional funding consideration by FEMA. States like Arizona are considered water-stressed areas, and reports also show that Arizona has a high cumulative groundwater depletion. So moreover, Arizona is one of the states that has direct authority to implement the underground injection control program as per FEMA. Going on to the next one, the Bureau of Reclamation's Drought Response Program supports a very proactive approach to drought by providing assistance to water managers to develop and update comprehensive drought plans and to implement projects that will build long-term resilience to drought. Reclamation's Title 16 is primarily for the construction of water recycling and reuse projects on a project-specific basis in partnership with local government entities. The WIFA, or the Water Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act, I think it's WIFIA, maybe, Act of 2014 established the WIFIA program. This is a federal program that's administered by EPA. This is mostly for eligible water and wastewater infrastructure projects. In addition to projects that qualify for water supply and water recycling projects, drought prevention, drought mitigation, and drought reduction projects are also eligible for WIFIA. There is a minimum size requirement of 5 million for small communities and 20 million for larger communities. I think Phoenix is a recipient for WIFIA for upgrading their water supply infrastructure back in 2018. The State Water Infrastructure Financing Authority, or the WIFIA, is exclusively for state infrastructure financing authorities like the WIFA, whom we will hear from soon. Building resilient infrastructure and communities, or BRIC, is one of FEMA's newer programs and makes funds available to the states, local communities, tribes, and territories for pre-disaster mitigation activities. The catch here is that the states or territories must have received a major disaster declaration in the 7 years prior to the grant application. The U.S. Army Corps also has a program, also authorized under the WIFIA, and enables local investment in infrastructure projects. The USDA has several programs for rural communities and economically disadvantaged communities, and also border communities or colonias, primarily to improve water systems and waste disposal systems in rural areas. And finally, the Housing and Urban Development's Community Development Block Grant Program, which most of the communities in Arizona do take advantage of, but they have previously provided grants for long-term needs to rehabilitate, construct, or buy public facilities or infrastructure, such as water and sewer systems. HUD's Natural Disaster Resiliency Program is specifically meant for states that have had a major disaster declared, like FEMA's break. So with that, I didn't really go into detail on all of this. There is a report that is attached to this meeting, and it has a little bit more information on all of these funds. As far as disasters or disaster declarations, this is just my personal opinion. As a state whose major water supply is under stress and has been under a drought for more than 2 decades, and where the other major water supply is a non-renewable source, perhaps our state might qualify for a natural disaster declaration and perhaps qualify for these funds to mitigate the effects of drought. That's just my personal opinion. The problem with the federal funds, though, is that it does come with federal strings, right? There is usually a cost share and extensive environmental compliance requirements, in addition to compliance with American iron and steel provisions and so on. So it usually is a roadblock for smaller communities because they don't want to provide all of the documentation, or it's somewhat cumbersome for them to do that. So if you go to the next slide. So maybe it's the extensive documentation. I don't know what it is, but for some reason, our state is rarely featured in the list of recipients for 2 such federal funds. I brought this up because I thought the visual was very stark. These 2 funds are primarily for water infrastructure and tackling drought. The only two times that Arizona was a recipient was in 2018 under the EPA WIFIA, and that was for the city of Phoenix, who was awarded monies for their water main replacement. And then under Reclamation's Drought Resiliency Program in 2021 for Scottsdale for an aquifer storage and recovery project, and the Navajo Nation for booster pump stations. It was a huge revelation to me that Arizona was a recipient of these federal funds just twice in the past 5 years. And I thought it was important information for me to share. So if you move on to the next slide. Now we just went through federal funds. I also showed you some of the revelations that I found. We also have a few state administered funds. Also a caveat here that my research on these funds is not entirely adequate. So there may be some misinformation and some gaps. So if there's anybody in the audience or in the committee that finds a mistake, please do let us know. WIFA administers the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Daniel is here to talk about WIFA, so I will leave it alone and not go into detail on that. ADEQ has several programs that they administer under the EPA's Clean Water Act. Primarily, these programs are for the purpose of improving water quality. ADEQ's Water Quality Improvement Grant Program and the Watershed Preservation Grant allocates money from the United States EPA to interested parties for the implementation of non-point source management and watershed protection. The WARF funds are for the purpose of cleaning up soil and groundwater contamination. The WARF, however, is a state fund. It is statutorily mandated to be funded by corporate income tax revenues. However, they have received funding from the corporate income tax only twice in the past 18 years. And this was from ADQ's report back in 2018, so I don't know if it has changed since then. They have, in those years that they don't receive the CIT revenues, they have operated either in deficit or by using agency cost savings, emission inspections fund, air quality fund, recycling fund, I think the underground storage tank and revolving fund, and the Permit Administration Fund. ADWR administers the Water Management Assistance Program and provides financial and technical assistance to develop, and implement conservation programs, facilitate augmentation, and renewable water supply utilization, and to obtain information on hydrologic conditions. This program is funded through the groundwater withdrawal fees. We also have the Water Protection Fund that is administered by AWR. This does receive money from the legislature, but those are primarily for riparian projects. Finally, we have the Greater Arizona Development Authority, which was established by the legislature in 1997 to assist local and tribal governments and special districts with the development of public infrastructure, including water infrastructure. This program, however, unfortunately is currently dormant and has not been funded. We also have the Rural Water Infrastructure Committee. This is not really a funding source, but rather a hub of information for entities that may need funding to come to compliance and so on. The members of the committee include agencies like the USDA, the WIFA, the DEQ, DWR, and also the Commerce Authority, who may have some funds available to help these communities come into compliance. The catch here again is that not yet, Jenna, if you go back to the previous one. So a lot of these funding sources are still primarily federal funding. So the federal strings that I've mentioned in the previous slide still apply, and perhaps it continues to maybe a disincentive for smaller communities. Now we can go to that next slide. So with that, now we provided the current available funding from the federal and the state. With that, I want to turn your attention to the amount of monies that the state has spent on water. What you're looking at is ADWR's operating budget and appropriations for other items such as rural water studies and so on over the past 22 years. The budget has remained relatively flat, except for the spending for DCP in fiscal year 2020. This by no means is comprehensive, so please forgive me if there are things missing. It doesn't, for example, include the water bank funds or the war funds or the WMAPs, the other things that may have been spent from other sources. Yet, even if those were added in, the spending would still be eclipsed by money spent on water infrastructure by other states. And I wanted to show the committee this chart because in the next few slides, we will take a look at what some of the other states are doing. So Jenna, if you could go to the next slide. Next slide. So the state we love to hate, California. We complain, California has a lot of taxes, but they started infrastructure legislation specifically for water back in 1959. They approved a $1.75 billion for the construction of water infrastructure. In addition, the David Grunsky Act established a statewide financial assistance program for local public agencies to better develop, control, and conserve California's water resources. I think it was around 130 million. I couldn't find specific dollar amounts. And they have continued to invest in water infrastructure. In their latest legislation back in 2019, SB 200 signed by Governor Newsom to establish the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. 130 million was provided in the 1920 budget. And I think that's 2021. It may be a typo, I'm not entirely sure anymore, but a 5.1 billion package supporting the state's water infrastructure and drought response was announced as part of the governor's California Comeback Plan. In addition to all of this legislation, they primarily use three funding mechanisms: the State General Fund, the State General Obligation Bonds, and designated special funds. California utilizes the designated special funds the most. Most of the projects in California has been funded by the special funds, and those funds use for revenue source, state fees, assessments, taxes, and other revenue sources with very specific designated purpose. So let's move on to the next slide. And this is Texas. Earliest legislation in Texas was in 1957, when the legislature created the Texas Water Development Board and charged the board with long-range planning and financing water infrastructure and delegated bond issuance authority to the board. While the board itself has evolved over the years, a significant change came around in 2013 when the state legislature established the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, or the SWIFT, and the State Water Implementation Revenue Fund for Texas, which is the SWIFT, which is what I'm showing you at the bottom on the left side, 2013. The legislature, in addition to these programs, which are meant to provide affordable, ongoing state financial assistance for projects in the Texas State Water Plan, the legislature also authorized a one-time $2 billion cash infusion from the Rainy Day Fund to help fast-track cost-effective loans. More recently, the legislature expanded the board's mission to include the Flood Protection Fund, which is the FIF, and the Texas Infrastructure Resiliency Fund, or TURF, and set aside $793 million from the Rainy Day Fund. Texas, their funding mechanisms are primarily through the Texas Water Development Fund, the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, State Participation Fund, and the Rural Water Assistance Fund. The Texas, or the recipients of these grants primarily go for the Texas Water Development Fund, and the revenue source for that fund is the revenue bonds issued by the board, because if you remember, they created that in 57 and also delegated bond issuance authority. It's a self-sustaining fund. Let's go to the next slide with Colorado. So Colorado, unfortunately, I couldn't find where their earliest legislation was. I have called them, emailed them many times. I did not get a response. But in 2018, they did appropriate $10 million from the Colorado Water Conservation Board Construction Fund for FY 2018-19 to implement the Colorado Water Plan. Colorado, however, has very innovative funding mechanisms. They have the CWCB, or the Colorado Water Conservation Board Construction Funds, and the revenue source for that primarily is from the repayment of loans, interest, and federal mineral royalty distributions. They also have a severance tax trust fund, out of which 50% is allocated to build water projects. And the tax revenues, or the revenue sources, tax revenues from producers of oil, gas, coal, and minerals. There's also the Colorado Water Resources and Power Development Authority loans and grants. They are funded by revenue bonds. And finally, they have the Colorado Healthy Rivers Fund. The revenue source for that is the Colorado Individual Income Tax Refund. It is a voluntary program. Taxpayers just check off a box when they file their taxes, and that funds the Colorado Healthy Rivers Fund. So let's move on to the next one. So as you just saw, most of the states that I talked about recognized early on the importance of funding water infrastructure, and they have continued to fund and develop new revenue sources to maintain healthy funding sources. Here in FY22, the AZ state budget has created and set aside $160 million toward the drought mitigation revolving fund. The fund is to facilitate the forbearance or water deliveries that would avoid a reduction in Arizona's Colorado River supplies. Trying to think and remember what else was there in that. So, oh yeah, the fund also sets up a 7-member board with 3 non-voting members. The board members are to have a strong background in water issues within the state. The appointment members would serve 5-year terms. State land department may apply for grants, and the fund is to provide low-cost, long-term loans for planning, designing, constructing, or financing water supply development projects. They're also set aside, or the budget also set aside $40 million for the water supply development revolving fund. This money must be used for projects that are located throughout all regions of the state and outside of AMAs, not to exceed $1 million per project. I believe Daniel with WIFA has more slides to explain more about the $40 million and the water supply development revolving fund. So I will stop here on the Arizona state budget. And the one last thing that I wanted to say before we move on to the next slide is that we did research a few other countries. Primarily, while their funding mechanisms included revenue bonds, water taxes, or tariffs, their approach has been very different. Again, this is all encapsulated in the report that was provided to the committee. With that, if we could move to the next slide. And that was my presentation. With this, I will turn it back to Sandy for some concluding remarks. Sandy, I hope I went a little bit slow. I was trying to talk slow.
I think you did great. So I appreciate all the work that you've done, and I'm sure everybody else on the committee does as well. So thank you, Vinitha. Um, really, the gist behind, sort of going back down this path, I mean, we recognize that we're mostly water people, we're not finance people. And so the issues that we face and as the committee, as the long-term augmentation committee is looking at alternatives, we felt it would be remiss on our part as we identify potential augmentation projects, if we didn't also include potential funding opportunities or what is out there and what other states are doing as sort of a guidepost for what is possible in Arizona. Now we recognize again the $200 million that was put into the state budget this year, which is unprecedented in this state at least at the state level, and really commend the legislature for their foresight in including this in the budget. And that's really where we wanted to go. I mean, ultimately, as you can see, there's several federal funds available. There's a lot of, I mean, all those require a match, and funds like this or funds like what we've done this year in the budget are very helpful in meeting those federal match dollars and leveraging those dollars more for Arizona than we have in the past. Also, opportunities for public-private partnerships are out there. As a private entity, we look for opportunities to cooperate and collaborate with our communities on infrastructure and water supply projects for renewable supplies. So there's a lot of great opportunities that are sitting out there today, but we can do more, and that's really our recommendation that's coming out of the subcommittee for the committee to consider, and that's to support and build on the current 200 million in the budget, or that's just been approved in the budget, by providing consistent and dedicated annual funding source in subsequent state budgets that ensure Arizona can sufficiently meet its needs into the future. So with that, we're ready for questions, or we can move on. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to also remind you that you are welcome to put your questions as we go through these presentations in the chat, and please direct those to everyone so that everyone can see them. Thanks. Doug Dunham has a comment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I sometimes have audio issues. Well, first of all, Vinitha, thank you. There was a lot of work and a lot of information that was really, really informative. I appreciate all the time and effort that went into that. And I am pleased to see that, at least in the water infrastructure side of things, the federal funds at least seem to recognize the existence of private utilities. Our experience has been a lot of the water quality funds that are available out there are strictly for public entities and do not include private utilities as a thing. So that's good news, because the private utility sector is very large in Arizona. I just wanted to follow up the comment that Sandy made on the public-private partnerships that are potentially out there. EPCOR, we have been developing a lot of experience with that in very large infrastructure projects in Texas. We have just landed a new project that we're working on up in Washington, right outside of Seattle, Lake Oswego. It's a huge project for replacement and modernization of a wastewater facilities up there. So I think that's another thing that helped leverage available state funds, bring in some private monies to partnership with the local utilities, and then that can help further spread the cost burdens among and bring in some of that federal funds. So again, Benita, thank you, and I'll sign off here.
Seeing nothing in the comments, I think we are ready to move on to the next presentation.
I think Wade was saying something, but he might be on mute.
I think maybe the microphone wasn't close enough to my face to pick it up. So are there any other comments or questions regarding the financing report that we heard from Benita? We'll go ahead and listen to the other report, the WIFA report at this time. I think it's Daniel D'Alessi that is making the report. Daniel, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for inviting us here today. We've prepared a brief overview of WIFA's existing programs, and then also included a little bit more detailed overview of how we plan to implement the Water Supply Development Fund. So let me get the next slide. Okay, so WIFA is the State Revolving Fund Administrator. I'm Dan D'Alessi. I'm the Executive Director. Get the next one. Okay, so this is a tricky one. I'm sort of rethinking my decision to make this animated, but we've got a handful of programs within WIFA. We've got the Clean Water Program, the Drinking Water Program, and the Water Supply Development Fund now. So in the Clean Water Program, we can offer loans and technical assistance to political subdivisions, basically public entities, cities, towns, special districts. In the Drinking Water Fund, we can offer loans and technical assistance to public water systems, and that includes private public water systems. So right now, it's just private ACC regulated systems, but we're actually expanding that based on the federal guidance, and we believe that we can do also non-ACC regulated. So we're going to expand that. We want to make sure that our reach goes to the greatest possible number of systems that need assistance. And then the Water Supply Development Fund. This one's new, but again, it's loans and technical assistance to water providers, which is defined in the statute. Go to the next one. Okay. All right. So WIFA, just a little bit of background on WIFA. Our numbers over the years, we've been around since 1989. And in that time, we have funded $2.6 billion worth of infrastructure projects here in Arizona between the Clean Water and Drinking Water revolving funds. We currently have 290 active loans all across the state of Arizona, and active is basically a loan that is either in the construction phase or is in the repayment phase. Since 2009, we have put out $102 million of Forgivable Principal, and so that is the part of your project that you don't need to pay back. That money comes from our federal grants, and we, since 2009, have gotten an allocation for that each year. In the course of the 30 or so years, we have had 211 different borrowers, and that is systems for clean water and drinking water from really everywhere in the state, from every county. We are a leveraged program, so we get our federal capitalization, we generate our match and interest and fees, but ultimately we also borrow from the capital markets, and our credit rating is AAA. So we can then pass on the savings from our low-cost borrowing onto our borrowers. All right, so eligible borrowers for the SRF program, cities, towns, tribal entities, and special districts. They have to own a community public water system or own a wastewater treatment facility, and that includes the collection and transmission lines. Also, we can fund the management of stormwater and watershed protection, a number of other things. Also, the eligible borrowers extends into the private entities as well. So we can do ACC regulated private water companies. And again, we are expanding that to include non-ACC regulated non-community systems for nonprofits, and then community systems that are also for-profit but not regulated because of their size generally. So as long as they're otherwise eligible, we'd like to be able to help them. Next one. So SRF eligible projects. So infrastructure, drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, watershed protection. One of our more recent projects that we're really proud of, we're doing watershed protection, forest thinning up in Flagstaff. And that's really, it's intended to protect the forest from catastrophic wildfires. And it's really important that we all start thinking of the forests as watershed and ultimately water infrastructure. So that's a new area for us, and we're excited about it. Project phases that we can fund acquisition, planning, design, construction, and improvement. And so that's the eligible projects. You want to go, oh, there we go. So the types of assistance that we can offer, the form that it takes, most often is financial assistance, which is essentially a loan. We offer a discounted interest rate from the market rate. We offer flexible loan terms. If a borrower needs a short-term loan, we can do a short-term loan. If they need a long-term loan, we can do a long-term loan up to 30 years. There is a condition that it needs to be the useful life of the project or less. So if the useful life is 5 years, you can't do a 30-year loan. But a lot of these projects have very long useful life, so it's good to be able to amortize that over the term. And then also, as part of the financial assistance, we do offer forgivable principal on many of our loans. So the other type of assistance that we offer is technical assistance. And our new program for technical assistance combines that with the financial assistance. So the way it works is that a borrower will go in, they'll apply for financial assistance on the website in the preliminary application, the project priority list application. And there's essentially a box that they check that says, we'd like to find out about getting some technical assistance to get us from the fact that we have an identified problem and we don't really know what the solution is going to be yet. We know we have arsenic in the water or that our well is failing, but we don't know what the best solution is quite yet. And so we want to be able to come in and bring some resources and help a community get to, what is the solution, how much is that going to cost, and then help them implement. So things that we can offer, it can be delivered both with a staff or contract professionals. Most of the time it's contract professionals. Planning and design and compliance with federal requirements, because we do have federal requirements because of our federal funding. And so we realize that is a challenge for especially the smaller communities. And in recent years, we've really made it our goal to bridge that gap. So we know that there are challenges that come with the federal funding. And here in Arizona, staff, we want to make sure that we make it as easy and seamless as possible. And so in some cases, we help compensate and just pay for compliance with those requirements. Next one. Okay, so a little bit more about Forgivable Principal, because this is a really popular benefit of our program. Just a year or two ago, we made a change to our Forgivable Principal policy on drinking water. So now all drinking water projects are eligible for some Forgivable Principal, depending on their size and the circumstances of the project and the community. And it breaks down into 3 tiers. So the first tier is a disadvantaged community that has a project that is addressing a public health threat. So if they have both of those circumstances, they are in the first tier, and that is the most generous. The next tier is disadvantaged community or they're addressing a public health threat. So it's one or the other, and that's also a very generous tier. And then the third tier is really anyone that's coming in with a project that wants to work with the program. And that is, it's the least generous of the three, but it's still offering Forgivable Principal on really any drinking water project. And so we've really seen that drive a little bit more demand, and it's been popular, and I think it's been helpful for all these communities. And the tiers work a little bit like tax brackets. So, the bigger the project gets, it's a marginal amount that gets added to the amount that we can offer in Forgivable Principal. And so it's kind of the opposite of a tax bracket, though, but it's just similar methodology. So the annual funding is determined by our federal grant award each year. Last year, in federal fiscal year 2020, we used $4.7 million of our grant as Forgivable Principal. This coming year, our plan is to use $5.9 million of our grant as Forgivable Principal. And Forgivable Principal is available until we run out. And so we do prioritize, as you can see, with the tiers, but also as we get close to running out, we start prioritizing with respect to, if there's just a project and then there's a project from a disadvantaged community that has a public health threat, we're going to go with disadvantaged community that has a public health threat. And so that is part of that process as well. The next slide. Okay, so Forgivable Principal on clean water projects. So this is wastewater, stormwater. It works a little bit differently because of the federal rules around that. Again, it comes in with our grant each year. And so here, there's a requirement that we use for, it has to be disadvantaged or green or going to stormwater. So in disadvantaged communities, we can offer up to 50% of the project cost. For green projects, which include energy efficiency, water reuse, reclaim, that sort of thing, we can offer up to 20% of eligible costs. And for stormwater projects, we can offer, again, up to 20%. So a lot of our clean water projects do fall into one of these categories. And so, it is definitely the case that a lot of these projects do get Forgivable Principal. It's just, it works a little bit different than drinking water. The federal grants, last year we used almost 4.3 million. And this coming year, we're planning to do the same. We're maxing out the amount that we're using for Forgivable from our federal grant. We found that with the federal requirements that come with the funding, it's very helpful to have a Forgivable component to bring projects in and get them working with us. So, and again, this is subject to availability and priority. We have it available until we've used it all, and we try to make sure that it's fair and equitable among the different projects that come in. And of course, priority goes to really disadvantaged communities. So, yeah, that is Forgivable for clean water. Next slide. The application process for WIFA is the borrower will go to the WIFA website and fill out the project priority list application. Staff will then take a look at it, check it for eligibility, score it based on the merits of the project and the economic circumstances of the community. They then will communicate with the potential borrower. The borrower will provide documentation of their debt authorization, and we'll send them the project finance application, which is a little bit more in-depth. When they return that, we review it for legal, technical, managerial, and financial capability. If they meet all those criteria, we then present it to our board, both of them. And with their approval, we then draft the loan documents, execute the loan, and move to the construction phase where we do site observations and disbursements, and then ultimately move on to loan servicing once the project is complete. And so that is WIFA. Before I dive into the Water Supply Development Fund, there was a brief mention of GATA in the last presentation. That program is more or less dormant at the moment, but there is capital in the program that could be re-leveraged, and we do have plans on the table to do that without any plan for asking for further appropriation. Further appropriation would obviously help the size that we could re-leverage. So, there is plans, and we administer that as well. I just didn't mention it because it wasn't specifically water oriented initially, but it was brought up. So if anyone's interested in GATA, we can dive into that offline. So the Water Supply Development Fund, as mentioned earlier, created in 2007 with House Bill 2692. Next slide. Okay, so it was almost operational in 2012 from our research. We found a bit of work that had been done internally back in that timeline when it apparently never got funded, and so work basically stopped. And here it was in statute, but not really ever operational. So when WIFA was consolidated into AFA in 2016 with House Bill 2666, the Water Supply Development Fund, as part of WIFA, although dormant, went with it. And so the statute was amended so that it basically stays under WIFA and then falls under the authority of the AFA. Water Supply Development Fund was amended here in 2021 with House Bill 2388. That expanded some definitions and eligibility, and also increased the amount that's available in grant funding. And then we've been following the budget very closely, and as mentioned earlier, there's $6 million in the state fiscal year 2022 budget available to the fund, and then also $40 million of a supplemental appropriation from fiscal year 2021 that came through at the same time. So we, now that it's going to be funded, staff is taking a new look at it. Much of staff actually wasn't here back in 2012, so we're a long dormant program that we haven't done much work with. We're diving into it. The plan is for it to work a lot like our other programs. It's a similar program in structure. I just saw a comment. It's a similar program in structure, and we have the institutional depth and experience in running a revolving fund, and so our plan is to run it in a similar manner. It being in WIFA, the advisory board and the AFA board will have the same role they do for our other two revolving funds. We are in the process of developing the criteria for the project priority evaluation and scoring to know what the subsidy should be. Also, again, the administration is going to be modeled on the current SRF process. One major difference will be that there's not any federal requirements. This is state money. And so the level of environmental review that will be at least required from the federal perspective is not there. It'll be whatever is practical and necessary based on the nature of the project in general. And then also things like American Iron and Steel and Davis-Bacon just aren't a part of this. And so that definitely makes things a bit easier within the state. Once we have our processes in place and policies and procedures and forms and outreach materials, we expect that we should be able to get the first rounds of outreach and start accepting the new applications coming up in about mid 2022 state fiscal year. So probably towards the end of the year. I've seen a couple comments that there's, am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right.
Okay, okay, great. I think our audio is fixed. Apologies for the interruption.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Sometimes we have intermittent service here in the office. I'm good with this slide unless everyone missed the last piece of it. There we go. So the new Water Supply Development Fund appropriation, the supplemental appropriation, the $40 million, our reading of it, and you know, there are folks here that were involved in this, initially is that the limit to $1 million per project is pretty straightforward. I think Vinitha read it a little bit differently on the second piece where it is initially limited to areas outside of the active management areas. We read that and a little bit differently. If that's not the case, then that works too. So we'll clarify that. But on the map here, you can see that there's a lot of area in the state that is not in one of the colored active management areas. And so that does give us a large region with many municipal water providers to work with. And so I'm sure there's plenty of demand either in the whole state or in just the areas that are not within an AMA. So ultimately, the program could be leveraged, so larger projects could be funded with bond proceeds. So if there's $40 million in appropriated funds, and we go out and find 40 projects for $1 million each, we find all those projects, and now we have a portfolio of $40 million worth of outstanding loans, and we go to the bond market and raise another $40 million to leverage that. We don't believe that limitation would be on the next $40 million or the funding as it comes back in the form of debt service on those loans. And so ultimately, the program will sort of evolve into just the overall program as written in statute. But I think the desire of the legislature to get this out to the rural areas first, knowing that the other $160 million dedicated to this purpose is happening in the larger, more populated AMA areas from the drought mitigation fund. So, and then also this can cover administrative expenses, and we do actually expect that we are going to have to bring somebody in, one more employee. We have openings here at WIFA that we can fill, and we feel like this is going to need the time and attention of somebody full-time. Go to the next one. The $6 million that is in the state fiscal year 2022 is essentially just Water Supply Development Fund. It doesn't have the other two conditions. And this, again, could be leveraged. So this could allow for larger projects in the first round even. These funds are available to systems throughout the state in or out of the AMAs, and again, can cover administrative expenses. It's worth noting that there was also an allocation for just other water projects assistance grants. That's $5 million that can go to purposes that aren't necessarily water supply and development, but it is another state appropriation to WIFA's program. So there'll be 2 new grant programs going out to specific counties with those funds. That's the 2 lines down from the $6 million. Next slide. All right, so Water Supply Development Fund, who is eligible? So statute defines water provider, and it's a very broad definition. It's almost any entity that we can think of that would want to engage in water supply development activities. And so, I mean, municipal water delivery systems, county water augmentation, county water authorities, public water systems, which is basically the universe that we can serve with WIFA now. Smaller counties, natural resource conservation districts. I mean, it's a very inclusive definition. So we have pretty broad authority to work with. Really, I foresee almost anybody who has an interest in doing one of these projects. Next slide. Okay, so what is eligible? Water supply development. This is where we differ a little bit from what WIFA can do now. There is a lot of overlap, but this is more specific. It's a little bit different. So we're going to have, it's nice to have a little bit more of an array of programs to offer communities when they're looking to do infrastructure projects. So water supply development activities, acquiring water or rights or contracts for water to augment the water supply, including the environmental and other reviews. And then also planning, design, building, or developing facilities. And so construction and everything that comes with it. So conveyance and for the purposes of conveyance, storage, or recovery, reclamation and reuse, replenishment of groundwater, and then also active or passive stormwater recharge. And so, you know, a lot of great work that can be done under this authority. And we're looking forward to working with communities that come in to take advantage of it. The next slide. So what will we be able to offer communities to get these projects done? So like I mentioned earlier, we're going to model this on the current SRF programs. We found it to be a really good model that works very well. And so we are going to offer loans, construction or planning and design, offer a discounted interest rate. There is a potential that as part of that, we would offer grants and technical assistance up to the $250,000 limit to help get these off the ground. There are other options that are provided for in the law, but we've not used them for WIPA. And in terms of having the fund revolve and be kind of a going concern and recycling those funds back into other communities as the program evolves, we don't really see a great opportunity for that to occur with some of these other options. So purchasing or refinancing debt obligations, purchasing insurance, or providing linked deposit guarantees. They don't really revolve as well in the banking model that has worked so well for our other two programs. And so again, they are available to us, and if it seems like they're a good option, we could always use them. But at the moment, we're gonna stick with the bank model that we use for the other two funds. And again, that model would allow for us to leverage, and statute provides for us to issue bonds to, you know, take that 46 million and turn it into, you know, close to 100 million ultimately, probably over 100 million in practical terms. So next slide. All right. So one of the things that is really, you know, front burner for us is looking at the statutorily defined categories for determining the priority of projects. This will also determine how deep of a discount we offer on the interest rate. And so we want to make sure we get it right. And so we're really looking into this now. We'll probably be reaching out to some of the folks on the call today or the agencies that they're with to really dial these in and get them right. So the 5 categories that are in the law that we need to consider with respect to priority are existing near-term and long-term water demands versus supplies for the provider and, you know, with respect to the project, existing and planned conservation and water management programs from that provider and also with respect to the project, current conditions, and also, you know, efficacy of the project with respect to that. So that's, you know, cost and effectiveness sort of a judgment. And then sustainability of the water supply to be developed by or through the project. So that one's another one that we'll definitely want to reach out probably to ADWR to get a sense for it. Well, you know, it's great that this potential borrower has a project that they would like to drill a new well or connect to another source. But how sustainable is that source? Is this a really, you know, viable long-term option? And we want to make sure that we're not making decisions in a vacuum. We want to get good input from our partners. And then the applicant's need for financial assistance. This is one we have a really good sense for because this is already a criteria for all of our WIFA projects. And we use the local fiscal capacity score, which takes into consideration the area's median household income, the rates charged for water and sewer utilities in that area. I mean, there's a number of different factors that go into that, and we have a good system already. So we're pretty comfortable with that one. We just need to get to some good measures that are consistent for the other four. So that is one of the things we're working on. Next slide. All right, so how do we intend to and envision executing on this new program? Not really that new, but newly funded program. So the program sits in WIFA statute and falls under the same authority as our other two funds, and so that's a pretty straightforward call where the AFA board will be the governing body, the advisory board for WIFA. This being a WIFA program will have the same role it does for the other two revolving funds. Applicants will submit a project through the online portal, just like they do with WIFA. Submissions will be reviewed for eligibility. Eligible projects are scored and placed on the project list. The applicant will show us that they have debt authorization, however that needs to be depending on what kind of an entity they are. We'll then provide the project finance application, which will be very similar to WIFA's because we also, in the law, need to assess the legal, technical, managerial, and financial capability of the prospective borrower to complete the project, operate the system, and also pay back the loan, and also support the ongoing maintenance of the project financially. So projects that are qualified will be presented to the advisory board and then the AFA board. With their approval, we'll move on to generating financial assistance agreements, which again, we need to generate a water supply development fund version of those without the federal requirements and things like that. From there, we'll move on to loan closing, instruction observation, and fund disbursement, and just repayment and servicing after that. With the repayment and servicing, any income that comes in over and above the return of principal that was originally lent out, that will go to grow the fund and mature the program in size and scope. So that is our plan for bringing this into reality, from funding to an operating program. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to have more of a discussion, but that is everything I have.
Are there any questions or comments for Daniel or for the committee?
Like somebody,
well, Daniel, did someone raise their hand?
Yeah, there's someone in the comments that has a couple questions.
Okay, that's Mr. Doba. Mr. Doba, go ahead and light yourself up and let's see what you got.
Hi, Daniel. Ron Doba with NAMWA, Northern Arizona Municipal Water Users Association. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Just a couple of questions. You mentioned that with the supplemental funding for the Water Supply Development Fund, I believe the $40 million, there was a cap on the size of the projects of $1 million. Do you know what the rationale is on that? I know that, if our hopes are to use this fund to help us resolve some of our supply issues, you just can't get much for $1 million. As I recall, I could hardly replace some rotted water pipe going down the street for $1 million. So I'm interested in what the rationale is on that.
So we are consumers of the of the law that came out. We didn't really have a lot of input on that constraint. My understanding of the rationale for it was that it was intended to make sure that it went to rural and smaller utilities, and that the $160 million that's going to the drought mitigation fund, which is a similar purpose, that's going to be run out of Department of Water Resources, is more intended for the larger projects. And so that is what we understand.
I can probably answer that, Wade, if you want me to.
Please step in and help. Hi, Representative Griffiths. Good to see you.
Good seeing you too. That's exactly the issue. There's a lot of projects that we can do in rural Arizona, and giving them the opportunity to spread the wealth throughout the whole state, different corners of it, so that one area didn't use all the monies up. And so we've done some really good projects in rural Arizona for water, macro water harvesting. And those projects, the last one that I'm aware of cost $2 million. It was $1 million matching funds, private funds. So we were able to do a good project, and that's primarily what we were looking at. One particular area could use all of that money, and we want to spread it out. And so the $160 million can be available for the larger projects. That was a great presentation, and Daniel, I'd like to meet with you after session.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And let's chat about the intention of what we were hoping to accomplish. We have a lot of opportunities. Yes, thank you.
Ron, do you have any follow-up on that?
I do. Thank you. I just had one more question for Daniel, and that has to do with the term on the repayment for the loans that are made from the Water Supply Development Fund. I know the current term for typical WIFA loans maxes out at 30 years. And of course, I think our hopes were years ago when the fund was conceptualized, that this could grow into a fund that could be used for some of the larger water importation projects that a lot of our communities have had, on the drawing board for years, like up north, the Red Gap Ranch project, Big Chino project, some of these importation projects that are going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Does that 30-year term limits, is that still going to apply to the Water Supply Development Fund loans?
The Water Supply Development Fund, I believe, I'm just looking at it now, has a 40-year term in statute. And so if that's not sufficient, we could probably try to work on getting that extended if the useful life of these kind of projects is much longer. But 40 years is pretty long. And so
yeah,
the
it is.
amortization, I mean,
Although,
even if there's some residual benefit.
Yeah, some of the major importation projects, I think it would be anticipated that they would have a very long life expectancy out of them, comparable to the CAP project or something like that. So, but yeah, that answers my question. Thank you. Very good presentation, Daniel. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. And then also in terms of size, those limits don't really apply to the leveraged proceeds. So if we were to leverage the fund from the current 46 cash funding to, even if we just leveraged it one time, that would put $46 million available that could go out in $46 million.
Gotcha.
And so, I mean, we have to do some planning and modeling to, check on the mechanics of it. But I mean, that's ultimately, as the fund matures, larger amounts would be available. And if it gets funded further legislatively in coming years, as Vinitha mentioned, I mean, it would grow quicker.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And real quick, like Garrett Corral, you have posted regarding the Forgivable Principal. Can you jump in and kind of explain what you're posting here and help us out? Five, four, three, two, one. He has posted, or she has, or for anyone that was interested in the DWF Forgivable Principal that Daniel spoke about earlier, this page has a table with example scenarios of the 3 different tiers that were mentioned. And then there's a link there in his chat. So if you want to look at that, please grab onto it.
I mean, I guess my example of being kind of like tax brackets only backwards isn't necessarily a simple example.
Daniel, everything you presented today has been well worthwhile, and we've appreciated it. Any other comments or questions for Daniel? Not seeing any, then we again thank you. Thank you for your time and an excellent presentation.
Excuse me, could I make a comment or question?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is Jeff Gibbs. This is more relation to the sources of funding. We did a good job, I think, covering the existing sources of funding that are out there, and that's very much appreciated. I wonder if we also looked at or going to look at potential future sources of funding which have not yet been tapped. I'm thinking for major infrastructure projects like the San Diego County desal project. I believe the county issued bonds for that $1 billion project. But we look to see whether Maricopa County or MAG or even CAP has the bonding authority to take on large scale projects such as those.
Does anyone with us have any thoughts about that? Representative Griffin, Sandy, Carol?
I can just jump in really quickly. If, you know, the WRDC did list different bonding as an option. It's sort of in the exist not existing, but existing known options that are available out there. And we just provided the list of what was considered before, including bonds, and what we're finding in other states as well, which many states are relying on bonds as a mechanism. So certainly it's something that could be considered as we identify different augmentation options. And perhaps maybe as we identify those options, we can tie, you know, specific options to that as far as financing goes.
I'm sorry, I guess I'm saying is if we were to undertake a desal project for the valley or for the AMA areas, who might be the lead agency on that, which would have the funding authority to be able to bring that to fruition?
You know, we, sorry, my audio's not working very well. I'm getting an error message. Certainly CAP is somebody who could step up. I mean, there's different options there. And I think as we develop those particular specific measures or those specific augmentation projects. So if desalination comes out of this committee, we could identify different funding options as well as entities that could lead in those efforts. So I would leave that until we identify that as a specific option. Just my
Thank you. Thank you.
Wade,
Yes, go ahead.
you know, we've been talking about desal for 20 years that I've been involved with, and we'll be talking about it 20 years from now if we don't do something. And that is a high priority on what we're looking at and where we can bring in additional wet water for the state of Arizona. So that is on the table, has been on the table, will continue to be on the table. And I look forward to working with you on that.
You know, desal has always, as you say, been an option. I think that in addition to some of the difficulties with location, supply, power, discharge, what we do with the brine, the cost has always been a significant factor, but something tells me that cost is a factor, and even some of the other problems are going to disappear rather rapidly as we face this drought situation, and money will be found and problems will be overcome, and desal is going to become a reality because it has to.
And
I totally agree. And it may be the cheapest water in the future for Arizona.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that 20 years from now we're actually implementing a desal option. So
Absolutely.
that's my goal. So I'm going to keep on that trajectory.
Absolutely. I'm with you.
And it's going to come small scale and large scale. We've identified that the two best sites are West Valley and down on some plateau near the end of the river, but we won't identify it too loud. And those are the areas that'll be looked at first. Other areas have been less attractive, but I suspect we're going to overcome the obstacles.
As long as
Desal,
we don't focus only on groundwater desalination, I think we need to look to the ocean as well. So that's my concern.
yes, and we all know. I mean, those of us who understand what's going on recognize that there are significant task forces that are looking at ocean desal as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I think now that we get to hear from Carol Ward about our storage site subcommittee and give us an update. Carol, are you there?
I am, Mr. Chairman. Happy to report to all of you today. I'm Carol Ward. I'm the Deputy Assistant Director for Planning and Permitting here at the department. And I will be providing a brief update on the Storage Sites Subcommittee's work. So as many of you will recall, the subcommittee's purpose, it was formed to assist the department in identifying criteria for the selection of potential underground storage sites for possible revision of the joint ADWR and State Land Department report, Potential Water Storage Sites on ASLD Trust Land, that was required by session law and completed in 2017. Over the course of the past year, working with the subcommittee, Representative Griffin, the bill's sponsor, and this committee, we decided to expand that report to include all 331 underground storage sites that had initially been identified by DWR. Representative Griffin passed a bill this session requiring the new report by December 31st of this year, and that was also signed into session law. Working with State Land Department, we have completed the report and we plan to submit that by July 15th. As a result of the discussions that we've been having with Representative Griffin, the subcommittee, stakeholders, and State Land Department, ADWR staff proposed a complementary project, the development of a guide to assist in identifying and taking the initial steps to evaluate potential storage sites at the local level. What we heard and what we're responding to is that having a source for information, getting a sense of ahead of time for what it takes to accomplish and maintain these projects would be valuable. So while the report identifies 331 potential sites across state lands that would be potentially suitable for storage, this guide that we are drafting will enable local stakeholders to identify the locations that will suit their specific needs and capabilities. The guide can be applied to any potential underground water storage site, including those 331 Arizona State Trust land sites identified by the department. The sections of the guide step the user through the process, progressing from high-level checklist items to more in-depth items that may ultimately require a consultant as the project begins to solidify. We shared an outline of this guide with the subcommittee and this committee and received positive feedback. Since that time, department staff have completed a draft of the guide. I would like to thank State Land and Maricopa County Flood Control District for their feedback on the draft so far. We've incorporated those comments and we have posted the completed draft to the website this morning. And we very much appreciate any input that this committee would like to provide on that draft guide. We want this to be as useful as possible. So I propose a deadline of July 16 for review and comments. We will incorporate the feedback that we receive, and depending on the extent of the comments, we may want to share another draft before we finalize it. If the comments are minor, we could potentially finalize the guide and have it posted by the end of the month. I would like to give special thanks to Emily LaDolce, who is the primary author of this document. Appreciate all her time and effort. Also, I would like to thank Jeff Inwood and Ben Alternator of DWR, as well as Representative Griffin for all of their valuable input and assistance on this project. Emily, Jeff, Ben, and I would be happy to answer any questions or take any comments that any of you may have at this time. Thank you for your time.
Carol, thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments for the chairs, for the subcommittee work that has been done here with regards to storage sites? Seeing none, is there a chat? I see none in the chat.
Mr. Chair, I will jump in. This is Carol again. Just wanted to let you know that the draft storage site selection guide can be found under the storage sites subcommittee on the link that Jenna posted above in the chat.
Excellent. It's there if you get into the chat area. This is bringing us to a close of what we had on our agenda today. We need to talk about our next steps with regards to the 3 topics that we addressed today. We propose that each of those topics be taken to the council and presented there. Is there anyone that is struggling with that? Not hearing anyone struggling with it, then it will be the consensus of the committee that we go forward with it. Jenna, Carol, when do we see the next council meeting?
The next council meeting is on July 15th from 1 to 3, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay, will there be space on that for either full reports, or are we going to be abbreviating and presenting summaries of what we talked about today?
Wade, are you referring to a committee update from what we talked about today in this meeting to be on the
Yes.
council agenda, July 15th?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
We will include that.
And it might be helpful to have, well, we'll talk about it offline, but we do appreciate that. Then the next step for the committee is to participate in the council meeting on July 15. And then we'll see where we go after that. We have several issues that we've been working with that have been of concern as far as augmentation that we need to stay with, see how progress is being made, and we will inform the committee following the council meeting as to our proposed directions. Are there any questions or comments for the committee, for DWR, or for the chairs?
Wade, Stephanie Smallhouse has her hand raised.
Okay, Stephanie.
Good morning, Wade. Good morning, everyone. Just a quick clarification. So the comments that Carol would like by July 15th pertain to the link that was posted in the chat. Will we be emailed that draft, or do we just go strictly to the website to get that document?
Stephanie, this is Carol. We would be happy to email a link to that out to everyone so that it's easily available to you. You don't have to copy and paste it out of the chat. That's a good idea. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
And you can use the distribution list you use for notice for the meetings. Is that right, Carol?
Yes, we'll use that large distribution list and get all the feedback. So that would be very helpful.
Excellent. Any other questions or comments? At this time, we're not going to set a next date for a committee meeting. We will keep you advised as to when we select a date and the topics for discussion. Let me close by saying how much we appreciate ADWR, Jenna, Carol, Mr. Riggins, for the work that they put in to make it possible for this committee to function. We find them always to be in support, and they're always helping us to get done those things that we feel are important and necessary to get done. So thank you very much. And with that, we are adjourned.